Special thanks to Stale Donut and Ministry of Ennui Control for super sponsoring this video. Visit David X Newton on Patreon to join in. In 1996, Epic took their first step into the shiny new home PC environment Windows 95. As its name suggests, the operating system had been released the previous year, and during the lead up to it, Microsoft had made a big deal of the fact that the still mega popular Doom ran under Windows 95 to demonstrate its viability as a games platform. After the PC had spent a long time with the image of only being able to get games running on it with the help of a particle physicist, the new Windows made life easier for players and developers alike by abstracting away a lot of the stuff that was close to the hardware. No longer would players have to enter the IRQ, DMA and YMCA of their Sound Blaster to get in-game music. On top of that, the growing popularity of CD-ROM drives were renewing the appeal of home computers, and I remember that just about everyone in my class at school had got family PCs that Christmas. The gold rush for this new audience was now well underway, with the top developers gradually abandoning DOS over the next couple of years. Epic's first release in this new world was provided by one of their old friends Xland Games, which had changed its name to Chaosworks sometime since their previous partnership. They came up with Firefight, which is an isometric exploration shooter that somewhat resembles Zone 66 or Seek and Destroy. Straight away you can see the difference from the mostly VGA-based games they had released before. You fly around very crisp environments with a huge 640x400 screen resolution, able to explore the level with 360-degree movement. You play as Jackson, a pilot with the mysterious Phantom Council, who has a job which involves being told which buildings to blow up by a shouty bald Australian at the bottom of the screen. In this capacity, you're sent through 18 missions of roughly increasing difficulty, each of which dump you in a leafy jungle or alien wasteland with rocks, sci-fi buildings and no small amount of enemies. In each level, you have to carry out the orders given to you while making sure you're not shot down by the ground defences or the enemy ships. Missions can involve simple destruction of enemies or targets, ferrying people around, delivering cargo to places and so on, and the missions tend to unfold as you go, with additional objectives or changes of plan being sprung on you. The game drops the ball a bit early on with the second mission, where you have to scour the map for 19 stashes of nuclear weapons of varying degrees of hiddenness, but once that one's out the way, there's a pretty decent variety of things in the game to keep things interesting. There are also a good mix of enemies to test your piloting ability. You'll have to deal with enemy craft that range from fast and weak to slow and tough with different weapons, and ground defences include rapid-fire turrets and slow homing missiles that make sure you can't just dodge everything by strafing slightly out of the way. I found the difficulty level to be just about right, never becoming frustratingly impossible, but definitely punishing me if I ever got too cocky. If there's one thing I would rebalance, it's these mines which absolutely devastate you if you cough nearby. To deal with all of these, you have 6 different weapons, although not many of them are particularly inspiring. The powerful weapons look and sound fairly lackluster, and I found the most satisfying one to be all the way back on the second slot, which fires swarms of small missiles. Unlike some more irritating free-roaming shooting games that may have been mentioned before, the number of enemies is finite, and while more might appear off-screen as you go through phases of the mission, you won't find yourself under constant attack. You can detect the presence of enemies with the rather clever disc-shaped display around your ship. Each tick around you will get gradually lighter with the proximity to an enemy ship in that direction, and the arrow around the edge points to your next objective. It's quite a nice way of having a radar-style display without having to glance over at the corner of the screen. There are also little secrets for you to find here and there if you stray off the main path, giving you some extra power-ups like a double shield or smart bombs. The controls for the game are okay for the time, but deserve a special mention for just how frustratingly close they get to being comfortable in a modern setup as well. It definitely seems like the game was intended to be played with just the keyboard, with forward and backward movement and turning on the arrow keys, and strafes and other triggers on the left of the keyboard. However, my first instinct was that I wanted to use the mouse as well. Firefight almost accommodates for this, because there is an option to use mouse controls to control your aim separately from your movement. However, the keyboard controls remain relative to the direction your ship is currently pointing, so you have to perform rotations in your brain on the fly to work out if strafing to the right is actually going to shoot you downwards and crash into a cliff. In the end, I discovered I could comfortably play in a slightly absurd way by keeping my ship pointed north so that the WSAD keys would take me in the directions you would expect, with just the cannon on top of the ship rotating to face the mouse cursor. And that worked fine as long as I wanted to head vaguely northwards. In the end though, after giving the pure keyboard controls another chance, I found that they worked fairly well after all, being suited to performing strange robotic waltzes with the enemies as we circle-strafed endlessly around each other. Something interesting I found while researching the game was that it was sold as a multiplayer gaming kit which had 2 CDs in the box instead of 1, encouraging you to give one to a friend for online play. And besides the multiplayer deathmatch that you would expect, there was also an extra game mode that had you building bases on the terrain while attempting to hamper your opponents building theirs. This idea of encouraging multiplayer is like an early version of the spawned copies that Blizzard would later invent for their strategy games, allowing the owner of a game CD to install a multiplayer-only copy on a friend's computer so that they could play online and hopefully buy the full game off the back of that. I came into Firefight pretty lukewarm, not having played it before myself, but I found myself really getting into it as the game went on, and the variety of the missions was a pleasant surprise. Unfortunately, the game has a bug that means it can't run in modern versions of Windows, which is something to do with set Windows Hook EXA and setting the DW thread ID and other things that I don't understand in the slightest. As it happens, Windows 95 and 98 also had a mistake in them that cancelled the first mistake out, so it turns out 2 wrongs do make a right, but newer versions of Windows will fail to start Firefight up. It's possible that someone has released a patch for this, but I wasn't able to find one and had to run the game in a Windows 95 virtual machine instead, and it ran alright, but the sound took some tweaking and was always a bit clicky. I also can't find anywhere that sells it online, so you're pretty much on your own for this one. Suggestions in the comments for any easier ways to play it are very welcome. Real-time strategy games were also undergoing a boom in the mid to late 90s. Westwood Studios and Blizzard Entertainment had truly set the genre going in 1995, with Command & Conquer in particular being hailed as the miraculous achievement of being a wargame that wasn't coma-inducingly boring. Over the next few years there were many attempts to knock both it and Warcraft off their perches. 7th Legion was Epic's attempt at the genre. The name is coincidentally also used for a faction in World of Warcraft, but the games are otherwise unrelated. It was written by Vision Software, who were also the authors of Seek and Destroy, and it was Epic's only release in 1997, following the same pattern that 3D Realms was undergoing of releasing bigger games further apart. Its box art depicts a Warhammer 40,000 Space Marine dual-wielding laser pistols and riding a dinosaur with a further 3 cannons mounted to the side of its head, setting up expectations that frankly no game could ever hope to match. The scenario that it depicts goes like this. In the not-so-distant future, the condition of planet Earth had deteriorated so much that the higher-up elite of the world's population organised a planetary evacuation and blasted themselves into space. In their absence, the world's remaining powers redivided themselves into military legions competing for the remaining resources. After being gone for several hundred years, the Chosen, as they're now called, returned to the Earth expecting to be able to claim the vacant planet for themselves again, but instead the legions unite to repel the forces of the Chosen and keep the planet that they had abandoned. To sum it up in terms of gameplay, you build bases and units and you destroy enemy bases and units. What you'll notice as soon as you start playing 7th Legion is that everything runs at breakneck speed. The waiting around that's characteristic of the beginning of other real-time strategy games is completely absent. There is no build time for structures whatsoever. You click on your headquarters, click on a power plant or barracks, click it down and then carry on immediately, rapidly expanding your base even into unexplored areas. Once you have buildings capable of generating them, units are built within a matter of seconds, and can be made to build even faster if you spend a couple of clicks worth of time putting down multiple copies of the same building. You aren't even constrained by resources in the same way as other games. There are no worker units here that have to dawdle back and forward from Tiberium fields or gold mines, and instead of collecting valuable goods yourself, you're paid a salary of sorts every few minutes that can be boosted according to the number of enemy units you've destroyed. With the fairly major exception of the complete removal of the resource gathering cycle, the start of the technology tree is almost entirely lifted from Command & Conquer. Usually you begin a mission with a mobile base unit which can be deployed into a headquarters that allows you to create other buildings, and building a power plant is the only thing you can then do. After that, barracks will allow you to create infantry, a vehicle factory is needed to churn out tanks, and so on. Only 8 buildings are available in total, meaning that there isn't a whole lot of room for the game to introduce new ideas or strategies for building bases beyond the first couple of missions. As you build up your unit generating structures, you have to make sure that you're building enough power plants to support your base. If your power level, shown on the bar at the bottom of the screen, dips below your power requirements, your unit build speed will be dramatically reduced to normal RTS levels until you get it back up again. Where the game lacks a little in its copying of Command & Conquer's successful formula is that there isn't a whole lot of variation between the factions. The units that you have available are different depending on whether you play as the Chosen or the 7th Legion, but rather than making a separate technology tree for each side and requiring the player to learn the advantages and drawbacks of each set of unit and structures, the units you have available are mostly direct equivalents of the enemy ones with just a couple of changes that seem like they were trying to copy the other side's homework without making it too obvious. For example, the Chosen have access to the Dominator, which is described in the manual as a versatile walking tank with twin arm-mounted rapid-fire lasers, while the 7th Legion instead have the Inquisitor, which is a fearsome bipedal robot with high-energy lasers on each arm. There are a couple of interesting ideas thrown into the combat, though. Units can gain experience and level up in the same way that you can, being awarded titles for up to 4 levels of experience, and as they do so, their rate of fire and resistance to damage increases. This is similar to how units in turn-based games like Civilization and Battle Isle work, and it makes it a little more valuable to keep skilled units around and heal them at a hospital or repair bay, instead of sending them on suicide missions and churning out inexperienced units by the thousand, as the game otherwise encourages you to do. Occasionally, you'll also be given little challenges, like destroying 2 enemy buildings within the next few minutes, with the promise of a money boost in return. There's also a bit of a Magic the Gathering flavour, courtesy of the cards that are displayed in the top right of the screen. If you have fewer than 5 cards, you're dealt one at random every second time you get paid, and you can play them at any time by dragging them onto the battlefield. There are a dizzying 52 different possible cards, and they range from effects you'd expect, like temporarily powering up one of your units or giving you a free one, up to more unusual ones, like being able to disguise your units as those of the opposing force, or make an enemy building produce a random unit instead of the next one it's told to. While they're an interesting new idea, the cards really highlight 7th Legion's main drawback as a strategy game, which is that almost every element of strategy is neatly eliminated. The cards and the randomly spawning power-ups make the outcome of each level mostly dependent on luck. On my first attempt at Mission 1, I had got about 4 buildings in before I was hit with a production curse, and then an enemy soldier carrying a bomb sprinted onto the screen and detonated, utterly obliterating my base in a split second. I didn't think anything of this at the time, as I am historically bad at wargames and am possibly the only person to have failed the tutorial of Age of Kings after all my villagers were eaten alive by lions, but the next time around the Chosen didn't have the luck to have the bomb power-up spawn near them or get that card to play, and I was able to click a few dinosaur riders into existence and annihilate them very easily. Many of the cards have absurdly powerful effects, such as the one called Armageddon that reduces everyone's headquarters to 1 hit point and then destroys absolutely every other unit and structure on the entire map, and the only way to make the game predictable again is to use the Holy Curse level 2 card to prevent your opponent using any cards of their own. But again, you just have to be lucky enough to have this particular card dealt to you. Something else that I initially wasn't going to mention, but found becoming more of an issue as the game progressed, is the atrocious unit pathfinding. The maps are littered with scenery like cliffs, trees and rocks, all of which your units will resolutely fail to navigate and will instead trundle off to the far corners of the map and will just sulk there. You really need to micromanage your unit movement to get them to behave, and it's very hard to get groups of even 5 or 6 units to do what you intended. The problem only gets worse as you proceed and try to wrangle the vast armies that the game's lack of resource constraints encourages you to build. So, 7th Legion is an entry to the real-time strategy melee that has its base firmly rooted in an existing formula, but occasionally tries out some new ideas as well. It's unfortunate that those new ideas are generally not helpful to the enjoyment of the game. It does, however, have a great soundtrack by Blair Zupicki, which is reminiscent of his music from Seek and Destroy, and that box art is always going to be hard to beat. It's available on both Steam and GOG, appropriately priced at $7. However, continuing the trend of each game in this series getting gradually more of a pain to get running, the GOG release didn't work straight out of the box for me, and I installed it on a Windows XP virtual machine to get it running. With that setup, the background video loops on the menu screens run far too quickly and are likely to give you a seizure, but otherwise the game seemed to work okay. Arjen Bruget had let slip that he was working on a sequel to Jazz Jackrabbit as far back as 1994, but it didn't see release until 4 years later in 1998, having been developed by Epic and published under a new company called Gathering of Developers. Like its predecessor, it came out in several different iterations that were eventually combined. The first release was in the middle of 1998, followed by a bonus Christmas episode released in America at the end of that year, then an enhanced re-release called The Secret Files in Europe, then an attempt to re-release the Christmas episode in Europe that was lost when the publisher went bankrupt and was eventually resurrected by LK Avalon, who had previously done The Adventures of Robbo. The Secret Files release, currently available on GOG.com, is the one that I'm showing in this video, and it folds in the Holiday Hair 98 episode as well. As you can see, no absolutely shocking leaps were taken between the first game and this one. Your objective is pretty much the same as before, leaping and bounding through various types of levels with the aim of staying alive and reaching the exit. To set up the plot this time around, Jazz and Princess Eva Earlong had been in the middle of their wedding ceremony when the villainous Devon Shell stomped in, grabbed the ring and used it to disappear into a portal through time. Having been thrown in the dungeon for humiliating the royal family, Jazz now has to escape and run, jump and shoot his way through numerous environments across the torrents of time to retrieve the ring and save the day. This time he's not alone. At the start of the game you can choose whether you want to play as Jazz himself or as his scruffy brother, whose name I can't say out loud because in Scotland this word happens to be an awful insult for mentally disabled people. In the later re-release The Secret Files, a third character, Laurie, was also added, originally intended to be Jazz's brother's girlfriend but later canonicalized as their sister instead without the original artist's permission. Moving swiftly onwards, the basic gameplay remains about the same as the first time around, with your rabbit of choice armed with a big gun that can fire a wide variety of ammunition. The classics from the first game return with the addition of a few new ones such as heat-seeking missiles and a very satisfying flamethrower weapon. On top of these there are two power-ups that alter the characteristics of weapons. Power-ups called fast fires, which as their name implies increase your firing rate, and power-ups called power-ups, which can be found for each individual weapon and have various different effects on them. For example, the power-up to your basic blaster weapon will double its damage, which is something very valuable for a weapon that has infinite ammunition, and powering up the RF missiles will make the gun fire a third missile in addition to the usual two. In a funny contrast to Zargan's reward of more energy for collecting healthy power-ups, you can also enter a state called Sugar Rush by devouring as much cake and boiled sweets as you possibly can, where you can dash around madly and punch enemies to bits just by touching them. As you'll have noticed, one big visual change is that Jazz 2 is capable of running in a much higher resolution than before, with a maximum screen size of 640 by 480, similar to the other Windows 95 games. However, I found this to be a bit too zoomed out, as if I were seeing more behind the scenes than I was meant to, and I actually preferred to play it in one of the slightly lower resolutions. Having said that, the levels trend towards extremely large and confusing. Levels can be up to 4 times as large as the original game and be tens of thousands of pixels wide, so the additional screen space is sometimes very welcome to reduce the confusion as to where you're supposed to be going. In terms of new abilities, it seems the developers went slightly power-mad, attempting to prove Jazz's worth as a platform game hero by making him an amalgam supergroup of every other platform game hero. He's got a new stomp attack, a spinny legs run that can turn into a jumping spin, he can float across wide gaps by using his ears as a helicopter, clamber along chains, boost by spinning on vertical and horizontal poles, and the list goes on. The other characters aren't just cosmetic changes either. Jazz's brother, who I think I'll just call Baz for the remaining duration of this video, has the ability to smash through walls and double jump, opening up alternative routes through the level that Jazz himself can't reach. Laurie has a mixture of the other two characters' moves, including a sort of rising ear whip attack. However, through a rather fatal oversight, she was not granted a special jumping ability, and as a result, several of the levels in the original game are accidentally impossible to complete with her. Despite this, she has a personal fan site in her honour which still exists at lauriecentral.com. Slightly obsessive as that may be, she, Jazz and Baz do feel like they have more personality behind them than last time around. The character artwork really takes a step up from the first game, with nice fluid animations on the protagonists and enemies as opposed to the fairly rigid player sprite of Jazz 1. In fact, the cartoonish animations remind me very strongly of the Earthworm Jim games in places. A lot of this personality is thanks to animator Dean Dodrill, who created the Laurie character as well as the game's cinematics. Unsurprisingly, he would later become a well-known furry artist, and in 2012 he enjoyed massive success with his own solo game Dust, which was based on his Elysian Tale universe. On top of the more detailed animation, the game also has some nice lighting effects that come into play when you go into underground areas, as well as transparent tiles, but oddly these effects are only available in software graphics mode and will be disabled if you enable hardware acceleration in the game's options. Modern computers should have no trouble shifting around Jazz's graphics without the support of a dedicated graphics card though, so you aren't likely to find yourself needing it. In addition to the single-player game, Jazz 2 really put a lot of effort into its multiplayer modes, which were really coming into focus in games as more and more people were connected to the internet. Up to 4 players can play in a split-screen arrangement with people crowded round the keyboard, or up to a massive 32 in a networked game. The number of modes available to play online is unexpectedly large, more like what you'd expect from a first-person shooter, with various options for cooperative play, battle modes, games of capture the flag and other game styles. Like some of the other mid-90s epic games I've talked about before, Jazz Jackrabbit 2 was a victim of coming out a bit too late and being seen as old-fashioned on its release. By this stage it wasn't anywhere near as novel as the original game had been. Jazz 1 was a new and unique experience for PC owners, but by 1998 Sega had released ports of Sonic CD and Sonic 3 and Knuckles for Windows, and Jazz wasn't quite measuring up to the games from which it obviously took heavy inspiration. For this reason, it unfortunately didn't take off in anywhere near the same way that the first game had, and its relatively poor sales led to the planned third entry in the series never seeing completion. However, despite its poor initial reception, there still remains an enthusiastic fan community for the game at jazz2online.com. A lot of this continued fan following is thanks to the Jazz Creation Station program, which was bundled with the registered version of the game, and can be used to create new levels using art that already exists in the game or entirely custom assets. Levels can be very involved, with multiple layers of foreground and background tiles as well as an event system, so the possibilities are pretty extensive, even if I couldn't quite fathom it out within the time limit I set myself for putting this video together. In addition to being a place to distribute custom levels, Jazz 2 Online contains extensive background information on the game, tutorials on using the JCS level editor, a list of Jazz 2 servers that are currently hosting multiplayer sessions, various other editing utilities, and a community forum which holds annual awards on the best mods or levels produced that year. A couple of years ago they put together an unofficial 20th anniversary edition of Holiday Hair as a collaborative project. It's also the home of a fan patch called JJ2+, which adds a ton of bug fixes and new features for level makers, and is considered so essential that it's included in the GOG.com version. After the release of Jazz 2, the team who had made Tyrion, which was now called World Tree Games, collaborated with several members of the Jazz team and began work on another sequel as an unofficial project. They got a basic prototype together that was a major step away from the two 2D platformers, set up as a 3-dimensional continuous adventure environment instead of individual levels, and which looks quite a lot like one of the Nintendo 64-era Rareware games. Their ambition was to release it on the PlayStation 2 as well as the PC, but sadly they were unable to find a publisher who was willing to cover the costs of development. The prototype of Jazz 3 is floating around after having resurfaced in 2009, and while it's obviously rough around the edges in some areas, it seems pretty workable, and it's unfortunate that it never got the chance to be developed further. However, even if Jazz 3 never came out, the technology that it was being built on was about to become Epic's greatest hit yet. Later in the same month that Jazz 2 was released, the world would get its first look at Epic's major new in-house technology, the Unreal Engine. Thank you to everyone on the left here for supporting me creating Stumbling Tours videos. If you'd like to join in or make suggestions for other games to cover, please have a look at David X Newton on Patreon.